The first interview, entitled Don't Force Her into a Defense Corner, is with Derek Davies, editor of Far Eastern Economic Review.
There are some cynically realistic souls or realistically optimistic souls here in Japan who maintain that the automotive issue, from the American point of view, serious though it is after all the exit, not the exit, but the entrance, the way in of the whole complex of U.S.-Japan problems. They argue that the real entrance or the way out is the issue of defense. The Americans want Japan to step up its military capability. And so, although the automotive question is a very serious one, what the United States really wants Japan to undertake is to substantially and perhaps vastly increase its military outlays. Now, how would you deal with this line of argument? Do you think that there is some truth to this line of argument?
Well, personally, I do not think that the two issues are really connected.
I see. Mm-hmm.
I think defense is a separate one, argued by completely separate lobbyists and special interests in the United States.
I see. Uh-huh.
Economically, I would put it together with a tailwind, which international factors supplied the Japanese economy with. Part of that tailwind has been the free ride.
Right.
And this is, I think, what does annoy the Americans, and to that extent it is connected. Japan is efficient economically because it isn't saddled with a huge defense bill. But the people who are pushing for Japan to rearm seem to me to be unconnected with the automobile lobby. I don't think the people who are pushing for Japan to rearm have really thought it through. The question is really against what is Japan supposed to erect its defenses? Now, over the last 10 years, we have found that China is no longer an enemy. Indeed, it is remarkable to me that those countries which are encouraging Japan to rearm are all the enemies of Japan 25, 30 years ago. America, China, South Korea, even Southeast Asia, and of course Europe. That part of Europe which was not allied with you during World War II. The obvious answer is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is still in a state of war with Japan. The Soviet Union has occupied your northern territories. The Soviet Union has enormously increased its garrison and base facilities on the northern islands. Enormous provocations. Provocations which the Japanese appear to be willing to accept, because there is no way Japan is going to fight the Soviet Union. There's no way Japan, I think, can even contemplate erecting such a defense system, which would have to be not global, but it would have to cover half a hemisphere if you're going to protect your trade routes and your investments overseas, which is the usual rationale for defense expenditure by an international power. And that being so, there is a real question in my mind as to whether or not we are going to see yet another round of belly-to-belly hara rubbing with Mr. Suzuki preserving wa by telling the Americans, yes, we will do our best, etc., etc. Against that, I wrote an article last year saying that I thought the rearming of Japan was inevitable, not only because of the international pressure being put on it, but of Japan's new perception of its relative isolation. Did it trust the Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States post-Vietnam? In other words, would the Americans actually go to war? The shared threat of the Soviet Union, from the Soviet Union. The fact that the Japanese may be different, but not unique enough to be the only big, successful, powerful economy in history not to have a concomitant defense military establishment to translate that economic power into political military terms, if need be. But it seems to me that the militarists who ruled Japan in the mid-30s were able to persuade the Japanese people that economic success needed colonies. Well, the war ended not in economic success, but in economic destruction. And Japan, in the last 3 decades, has proved that economic success is perfectly possible without military power, without even a foreign policy, if you'll forgive me. So I am very much in two minds, and I don't have any easy answers. I think there are many factors which, particularly the historical parallels, which would say, yes, it's inevitable, must come. That, of course, plus the international pressure. On the other hand, the Japanese philosophically seem to me to be very unwilling to make decisions unless forced upon them. I find with my Japanese wife, don't force her into a corner. Then Pearl Harbor happens out of a clear blue sky. But while, and this has been the trouble with arguing about Japanese politics, 15 years ago I was writing editorials saying Japan must play a bigger role. Japan can provide a bridge between East and West, North and South. And Japan didn't have a foreign policy. It's terribly difficult to persuade a people to change when they are successful. Why change success? And I think the Japanese will go on as far as they possibly can, the way they have gone, and they will rearm, but they'll rearm, I think, to placate the Americans, only just that much.
I see.
That would be my guess.
So to that extent, you are rather optimistic, if I may put it that way.
Well, but you are, I know, a man of peace, and in that sense you represent the pacifist majority of Japan who...
Minority, let me tell you. Minority. Pacifist minority of Japan.
Well,
I'm
not according
painfully
to
aware of the fact that I am now in the minority.
Well, the vote and social surveys in Japan have always given an enormous vote in favor of being passive. The Japanese people are still saying, my favorite country is Switzerland. Of course, they tend to forget that the Swiss is one of the most heavily armed European countries. That's why they've been able to preserve their neutrality. But, all right, so let's not argue about minorities and majorities, but the voices of militarism, I agree, are growing. The straws in the wind, the visit of politicians to the Akasune shrine, the noises made by generals who later resign, but they make their point the planes are allowed to go up with bullets and missiles.
Handwriting on the wall.
The RIMPAC, naval exercises, joint naval exercises in the Pacific, the visit of your commander-in-chief to South Korea. All these put together don't make a haystack, but obviously the idea of a Japanese Army, Navy and Air Force as opposed to the ridiculously named self-defense forces
is an armed euphemism, isn't it?
It's a euphemism, but it's one growing in legitimacy. It is it's now one can discuss it. 5 years ago,
of course,
undiscussable, really.
But the question I would like to raise to you, Mr. Davis, because you are so conveniently and strategically located in Hong Kong, as a Britisher, and the question I have in mind is, should Japan decide to go the military route by stepping up its capability enormously, do you think that would pause a stabilizing factor to this part of the world, or that would rather represent another destabilizing factor in this part of the world? That is the thrust of my question, Mr. Davis.
Japan as a destabilizing force in Asia, East Asia in particular, is seen only economically. I think the majority of Southeast Asians, at least their leaders today, would say that Japanese army would be a stabilizing influence. Of course, perceptions in Asia differ. the Indonesians and the Malaysians tend to regard China as the ultimate enemy still, and to discount the Soviet threat. The Singaporeans, the Thais, and others see Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union, as the threat, and that view has been strengthened since Afghanistan. It doesn't matter which you choose, whether it's the Chinese or the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, I think, has shown, ever since Reagan came into power, that it understands the use of force, or strength, rather. It has responded by saying, let's have a summit, to Reagan far more positively than it did to Carter, of whose pacifism it took advantage in Angola, in Ethiopia, Somalia, in the Horn of Africa, in Afghanistan. So strong forces lined up against Soviet adventurism seem to me, and I think seem to a lot of people who live in Southeast Asia, basically a stabilizing force, simply because it deters the Soviet Union from adventurism.
The final theme we would like to cover is the point that you raised at the very outset of this interview, and that is the growing arrogance and haughtiness on the part of the Japanese. I, for one, feel terribly concerned over this obvious rise in our self-confidence, even to a very excessive degree. The reason I feel so scared and concerned over this situation is that before the war we went through the process of self-praise, culminating in excessive self-confidence, which in turn gave rise to excessive self-illusion. And I'm not saying that history will or may well repeat itself, but I'm not without some rather eerie sentiments about this situation. And I might also mention that just about a year or so ago, an ex-official of the Science and Technology Agency of the Japanese government, who now teaches at one of the national universities, authored a book. I cannot recall the title of it, but the thesis of the book was that Japan, by any test, is the most advanced political entity on the face of the earth. Japan far surpasses the United Kingdom, the United States, France, and the rest of the so-called democratic world in terms of the degree of the maturation of democracy, which astounded me. I mean, I just could not force myself to even deal squarely with an absurd thesis like this. But this book was rather warmly accepted by the Japanese reading public and so on. So arrogance is right here. Now, how would you counter this kind of argument?
There is a growing self-confidence and quite a justifiable pride in achievement. Now, this very often shades off into arrogance, and you've mentioned one prime example of it. But even that, has a great deal of justification. You found it difficult to believe, but there are many Western societies now, and I'm not talking about Ezra Vogel's book, Japan as Number One, who would very much like to be able to reproduce in their society the sort of inbuilt stability that your Confucian values bring, that your system of extended family responsibilities bring, of the way in which you manage to have urbanized without slums, filth, crime. You've got slums, filth, and crime, but nothing like other Western cities. And there is a great deal to admire. Some of your techniques can be exported. Management techniques, lifetime employment, all would be perfectly adaptable in the West. There are others which can't be. That feeling of, if you like, Yamato Tadashi, this homogeneity of Japanese society. Western societies can get together and be united, which is why successive British prime ministers vainly called for a return of the Dunkirk spirit when Britain stood together alone. But I think, quite frankly, although arrogance is there, and although the old cliche of the Japanese not knowing how to run a completely equal relationship, they can admire someone, give me your omeshi, and I'll know how much I should bow, or they can not despise, but slightly look down on someone, but find it very difficult,
right.
Apart from their own classmates, to find this completely equal relationship. And now you are outperforming Western societies at what Western societies taught you to do, or what you learnt from them to do. You are now doing better. It's going from there to there. And there are dangers in this. But as I say, there is much to admire. And I don't feel, quite frankly, that the lunatic fringe who talk about Japan as the greatest living exemplifier of how to run a society, they're going to have a... You can't in this day and age. Internationalism is the key word. Well, everyone's got to come to terms with...
I'm afraid that we are good either at licking your boots or sitting on your head.
You're good at a lot of other things too.